next question. This was very interesting. I got a lot of questions about this. Kind of people wondering, well, do you know what you're trying to do when you're starting a level design from a gameplay perspective? Do you know what you're trying to accomplish? And my answer to that is always, always. You've got to understand it's critical for level designers to understand what the gameplay design goals for the game actually are. As you're approaching a level, I'm going to switch slides here. As you're approaching a level, every encounter is really an integration of the core mechanics of the game, what Miyamoto calls the 3 C's, which are camera, controls, and character, and the game mechanics of the game, which are the unique elements that you're using to build the gameplay that you want to create. Now, of course, gameplay can come out of the core mechanics as well. For example, in a platform game, running and jumping with the character and how that character moves is a huge part of the game. There's no question about that. So the core mechanics do feature into gameplay, but you've got to know what those things are. It's imperative that you not only know them, but that you understand how you plan to express them in the level. So the question, do you know what the gameplay is when you want to start out? Absolutely, you have to. Let me just quick show you a slide here. This is, again, kind of some materials that we'll talk about a little bit later on, but as you're thinking about your level population, how you're going to populate your levels with content, you've got to be thinking about how the core mechanics and how the game mechanics are going to live in the space that you're building and express those mechanics for the player. It's an incredibly dense topic, and there's a lot to talk about there, but yes, the short answer is absolutely. You've got to think about those two things at the same time. And I have some tricks for doing that, so we'll talk about that later. Oh, what a lovely segue. When designing levels, do you have a priority list of things to consider? So the answer to that is I have a process. Over my 20 plus years of level design, I learned a bunch of lessons. I tried doing it a bunch of different ways. And ultimately, I came up with a process that it's based on my own experience. It's based on, kind of all the different games that I've worked on and the lessons that I've learned, either happy, bright, cheerful lessons that were, easily learned and made my life better, or horrible, painful lessons that I learned through repeated failure and, reprimands from my betters. Anyway, I actually have a process. So the priority list is determined by the process that I like to go through. And I'm just going to show you this slide as an example. This is one part of my process as I'm going through. These are kind of physical parameters that I want to think about as I'm building my level. As I'm going through my process, I'm like, okay, I got to think about this and think about that, and I've got to fold the decisions or the elements into the level as I'm making it. So I have a set process that I like to go through that, as you probably would guess, goes from the macro to the micro. That I step through. So the priorities, since that was the question, do you have a list of priorities? The priorities are set by the process. And the nice thing about having a process is that I don't have to make it up every single time I'm going to work on a game, and I can rely on it. I know that I have it in my pocket, and I can, not literally in my pocket, but figuratively, conceptually in my pocket. I can reach for it and rely on it without having to reinvent the wheel each time I'm going to sit down and work on a game. I can teach it, which is actually what we're talking about today. All right, moving on. This was another kind of common question. Got a lot of questions about this topic. How difficult is it to create a unique level or world? It's either hard or easy, depending on whether or not you do it the hard way or the easy way. There are a number of techniques for making unique concepts for your worlds. Let's let's talk about one of the techniques right now. Let's get into that a little bit. In my process, there are a few techniques that I routinely rely on. There are other ways, to come up with interesting concepts than this, but the four that I really like to rely on the most are what I call the core fantasy technique, the wish fulfillment technique, structural themes, and doubling down. We already talked a little bit about structural themes, although there's a little bit more to it than that. But let's talk some about the core fantasy technique for creating original content. A good way to think about this is how you might take one of those sources of inspiration that you learn, that we discussed at the very beginning, that whole idea of you getting inspiration from movies or comics or anime or whatever source you like, and trying to find a way to express it as a level design. And for me, in the core fantasy technique, I like to think about, okay, what is the intellectual property, that I kind of have in front of me, and what is most important about that intellectual property? And sorry, I guess I should start by saying, in core fantasy, we're gonna take those sources of inspiration, and we're gonna, I hesitate to use the word steal because it's such an ugly word, but we're going to tease out the bits that are valuable to us as level designers, and we're going to find a way to express them to make an original experience. So, for example, here's a picture from the Terminator intellectual property, and the concept of Skynet. If you don't know what Terminator is, if you don't know what Skynet is, all I can say is you got to look it up. I don't want to spend too much time talking about that for now, but we're going to push on. So figure out what Skynet is, learn about Terminator, and then these next comments will make some more sense. So we start with Terminator and the idea of Skynet. Okay, well, if that's a source of inspiration, then what really matters about that intellectual property? What would be very interesting about it? What is really at the core? What is the core fantasy, right? So for me, and again, you could argue any of these points ad nauseum, so we're not gonna, we won't get too deeply into it, but the idea of the hunter-killer robots in the franchise they're suggested by the movies. They're suggested as the sort of almost this inevitable future that's coming up. Not the Terminators themselves, but these massive, kind of terrifying war machines that are created to hunt down and exterminate human life. So the idea of these gigantic, cruel, faceless robots, very, very interesting. Not something that you ever see really in the movies, or that they're hinted at, but you don't really see them that much. But wouldn't it be cool to really explore that as a theme? And wouldn't that be really cool to explore that as a concept? Absolutely, yeah. I mean, so the core fantasy for me, of the Terminator intellectual property, yeah, the hunter killers are really an interesting thing. It could be fun could create some memorable moments. Next, of course, you have the Terminators themselves, humanoid killing machines, an android, or kind of a robotic exoskeleton surrounded by living human tissue, or at least they used to be. Yeah, man, bring that on. That's awesome. Like, how's that not cool? We could do all sorts of cool stuff with that, and every one of the Terminator movies does. They manage to, kind of create all sorts of interesting moments around that. So a big part of that core fantasy would be about taking the Terminators and just putting them in different situations. Can really make some memorable moments. Another part, and again, this is just a short list for me. If I was really doing this for real on a professional project, my list of things, memorable moments that I might tease out of the intellectual property could be, 10, 20, 30 things long, as I really find the most important bits. But time travel is a big part of the intellectual property of Terminator. But the interesting thing about it is that it bookends the stories. It is usually happening pretty much at the beginning of the movie. I don't even know if it happens at the end, but usually it happens at the beginning, and it's just sort of suggested, oh, there was some sort of time travel that happened, and you can see the end result of their weird time travel spheres that come through space. But wouldn't it be interesting? Wouldn't it be a memorable moment to actually get the opportunity to time travel in the franchise, to make one of those shifts, to go from a set of context that you're in into something completely different? I think that would be absolutely fascinating, especially as a player. So that would be a memorable moment that I'd really like to try to explore. So in my core fantasy technique, what I'm doing is I'm going through the intellectual property and I'm teasing out the things. It's like giant, faceless, cruel, robotic murder machines, humanoid assassin androids, some kind of time travel scenario. All of that could really add up and equal, oops, I skipped forward to them, and equal some very cool, memorable moments in a level, even if I wasn't making a game about Terminator, the intellectual property. I know, shocking, shocking. But think about it. I think you'll see what I mean. Okay, moving on. Boom. Question 8. I love this one. This is a kind of a verbatim quote that I used. If you had to make 100 levels for a mobile game, where would you start? And I really felt for the person who asked this question, mostly because I got the feeling that they might be faced with exactly this problem. Like, what do I do? And it's a great segue for me to talk a little bit more about the process. So as I suggested before, I don't like to leave this type of thing for guesswork. I have a process that's been built up for me, kind of through my own experiences of working on games, and so that's where I'd start.